Jonathan Jones, how are you, sir?
I'm good. I'm good. How are you, Kelly Parker?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great from frigid Cleveland, Ohio. Well,
That's
welcome
so
to the
funny.
show. We're so happy to have you.
I'm glad to be here. Glad to be here. Storytelling is so essential. So, I'm grateful for the opportunity and honor to be a guest.
Amazing. Well, like I had just shared with you, I know so many brands that either I've worked at, worked with, et cetera, that nowadays they're like, we should do a podcast. Or how do I get more people to listen to my podcast? Or what approach should I be taking for my podcast? And it is such a powerful tool to get your story out into the marketplace. And so I'm just excited to be able to chat with you and hopefully provide our listeners with some tips and tricks and strategy ideas in terms of leveraging podcasts. So for
Mhm.
those folks that don't know you yet, let us know who Jonathan Jones is and what he does.
Gotcha. So, just in the smallest sense, I help people ultimately maximize their brand authority by leveraging a podcast. Right. I've done two TEDx talks. I've published upwards of 500 episodes. Helped 60 plus people start podcasts. I mean, that's me in a nutshell. That's me.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Exciting. So what led you to this work? Kind of what has been your path to lead you to where you are now?
Yeah. So, just in terms of graduating college, had the bachelor's degree in psychology, and I realized one day that I had a book, right? I talked with my dad, Dr. Fred Jones, shout out to my dad, and he helped me write my best-selling book. We put it out, did the rollout, everything like that. And I was like, well, what happens now? And then I got to the spot to where I went to my alma mater and I was like, I want to speak. And I was like, well, Jonathan, what are you going to speak on? I said, I don't know, but I want to speak. And it was getting that opportunity to begin to put together a series of workshops at my alma mater, and then getting a hunger to not just speak, but begin to impact young professionals' lives, our future young professionals. And then after I came down off the high of just wanting to speak and finding different places to speak, I had to put a strategy in place. And then I was talking with my videographer, Reginald Titus, at the time, and he was like, well, John, one of the best ways probably for you to get your message out would be to do a podcast, right? And this was around the time where Gary Vee was talking about crush it and put out so much content every day and everybody start a podcast. And I was like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to start a podcast. And no, I don't think that was for me. After I slept on it, I called Reginald back. I said, Reginald, I'm gonna try it. I'm gonna try it. So after getting with him, then I decided to start the podcast. And the goal of the podcast was to strategically help me get more speaking opportunities, to partner with more schools. And that's what led us up to where we are today. But that was a different podcast some time ago, and it was called Speak Your Success. But that was really what started this whole fascination with podcasting, and that's really what's brought us to our point right now.
That's awesome. I love it. So you kind of alluded to it a moment ago about the strategy that you had in place that kind of propelled you forward to start and kind of was your guiding point as you have been podcasting. So can you talk about for those that might be on the front end of their journey, kind of how to set your intention and make sure that you do have a goal or objective in place for your podcast?
Most definitely. I love the question. Love the question. So first things first is we have to get clear on a couple of things. And this was something that I actually did not do with this first podcast, even though the goal was there. But like you're saying, the intention and really getting things down to the nitty gritty wasn't necessarily there. But you have to identify, one, what is the big purpose of the podcast? Right. So, what do you want the podcast to do for you? For some people who might be corporate executives, they might want the podcast just to drive awareness, to let people know what their company does, what their offerings are, just the background story of their business, right? Then there's other people who might just say, well, I'm an entrepreneur. Nobody has given me the opportunity to pitch my product or share my product. Well, this is an opportunity for you to begin to ultimately build your authority and credibility, right? So we have to get clear on what we want the podcast to do for us. Then the next thing we want to do is we want to look at who is our target audience and who is our target client, because those are two separate things. They're two separate people most of the time. Some of the time they can be the same, but most of the time they're really not. And the target audience is the person that you're producing the content for. Okay. So this is the individual who hears the podcast and then they get the tangible assignment or action to take from the podcast. That's the target audience. The target client is they hear you as an expert, they hear you and identify you as an authority, and they say, well, I want to hire this person to come in and do some consulting. So we want to separate those two as well. But I would say identify the purpose of the podcast and really drill down on the ideal client and the ideal or the target listener. And I think that puts you at a great spot. In addition to, and this one, this one is going to be, once you make the decision to start the podcast, you buy the book, you invest in the course, or you hire a mentor, whatever it might be, then shut off everybody else. If they're the person you're saying, I trust you, I'm going to go with your, I'm going to go with your process, I'm going to go with your philosophy, then follow that philosophy till it's success. And then maybe look at some of the other stuff if you need to, but you can't be in the middle of somebody's process and say it doesn't work. Well, you didn't complete the whole process. Complete the whole process and then see where you're at. But that's my tips to start out.
Oh, those are some good ones. I love that. Yeah, I started podcasting in 2020 and I didn't know a thing. I'm still learning, honestly. But to your point about picking a voice and following that voice through, I read an article, free article from Pat Flynn, who I have a lot of respect for, and he just like bulleted out like everything you need to do. And I took that article and I did every single thing that he said.
There you go.
So there's so much power in just following the process, whichever one it might be. So I love that. So I want to go back to what you said. You said someone had pitched to you the idea of a podcast and you were like, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So what would you say to someone who's like, yeah, I know that's a thing, but I don't want to do that? What are, some of the results that people are getting from podcasting, or, why is it such a powerful lever to pull, do you think?
Most definitely. So I love the question. Great question, Kelly. You're on one. Okay.
Thank you very much.
So I would flip it on its head and turn the question into statements and then say, do you want to build your authority? Do you want a top of funnel generation? And let me break it down in layman's terms. Do you want a way to get people's attention? Do you want to join an industry that's not saturated? Do you want a fast track to allowing people to trust you, to like you, and begin to know you? And if the answer to all of those is yes, then I say start the podcast, because we look at Facebook. Facebook has like over 1 billion users. TikTok has over 1 billion users. Even though there's the opportunity to go viral, yes, that is an opportunity, but you have to stick with it and you have to put out the content. But the podcast pairs well with any platform because you record long form content and we'll just call it 20 minutes of a conversation. You can chop that up into 15 different clips. You can post that on Twitter, on YouTube Shorts, on LinkedIn, wherever. And you can write a blog and further expound based on a video that you put out. So it's not really the fact of doing the podcast, but think about what other vehicle can help you explode your authority faster than a podcast. It's not going to be many. It's not going to be you writing a blog article on Medium. It's not going to be you putting a Facebook post out on Facebook, because the thing about putting out a post and putting out content, this is one piece of something that doesn't necessarily lead people back to you. But when you put out a podcast, people can follow the podcast, and then you can put out a freebie offer, and then people then will give you their email address, their telephone number, their name, and now you're connected with them, and you can send them personal emails. What's your favorite episode? Why did you like this episode? What's a problem that you're currently struggling with or facing? And when people begin to answer these questions, now you're beginning to identify, this is a target client. This is somebody I should work with and needs to work with me. And I know how to get them from the problem that they're having to a solution. So that's why I say start a podcast.
Oh, that's so good. I love it. What I like about what you said is, podcasting allows us to tell the right story to the right people and to figure out who those folks are and to be able to engage with them. And that's really what makes it so cool. So, want to ask you about content in terms of, you know, when you think about a podcast, do you have any best practices in terms of how to deliver the material in a way that keeps folks engaged and keeps them coming back for more?
So one thing I don't think that happens enough, because a lot of times podcasts are conversations, right? A lot of times. But one thing I don't think happens enough is you ask your audience a question and then tell them to like DM you back. Or let me put it like this. The full process I don't think happens enough, or the full strategy. For instance, we're having this conversation. At the end of the conversation, Kelly can say, if you really enjoy what Jonathan said, and if you really appreciate Jonathan's content, send me a DM and let me know the best part that you enjoy, the part that you enjoyed the most about our conversation. And then when they do that, now you're in a position to where you're like, oh, this is something that triggered people to engage. This guest gave them something to respond, at least to me, for. So now I can test out other calls to action. We need to make sure that we test out calls to action. And then when we see success with the calls to action, then we replicate the call to action. So that's one piece. But in terms of content, if you're somebody who was struggling with a master's in a master's program, but then you end up finishing your master's and got your PhD, more than likely the people who follow you, depending on your content, depending on your audience, and depending on, you know, what you're focusing on or what you want to be known for, majority of the people that are following you, they either want to be where you are or where you're going, or they're the version of you that was struggling with the masters. So you have to begin to think, what were you struggling with when you're going through that master's process? Was it the writing piece? Was it the research? Was it finding a way to show up for classes? Build content around the stuff that plagued you, because you know that there's going to be somebody else that resonates with. And going back to your point previously, Kelly, as you tell the story of your struggles and the strategies that you employed and the success that you've had, people are going to say, wow, I resonate with that struggle. I like that strategy. And at the end of the day, you can give people your whole life through a podcast, through a book, wherever. But when they get to the point to where they really want your help and they really decide this is the person for me, they can have all that stuff. They're going to be ready to pay whatever they need to pay to get you on a call, in front of them, in person, whatever it looks like. So that would be my thought just around content. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, that was perfect. I really love what you were talking about in terms of testing out the different call to actions, just the whole idea of test and measure, you know, like doing some things, seeing how it works, and then tweaking along the way as needed. So I'm over here taking notes for myself that I will be implementing. So thank you.
For sure, for sure.
So the other thing that we know about starting a podcast is there are a lot of decisions to be made, right? So what's the format of the show going to be? Are you going to be interviewing people or not? Are you going to be a 20-minute, episode? Are you going to do longer? Are you going to do once a week, once a month? But like there are all these different things you kind of have to pick and choose. What are you going to do? So in your experience, what are some best practices you think people should keep in mind as they're trying to make those decisions?
Yeah, so best practices, one would be this, and I'm gonna give Odell credit for this because I feel like I had the same idea after he already told me. So I feel like it's his idea. So I'm gonna give Odell Bazell credit for this. But interviewing your clients as guests, right? Because when you interview your clients, you basically can have a live coaching session on the interview as you're asking these people their story, or what they struggle with, what's their challenge. And as you interview them, it's going to become more and more prevalent to them how much they need you, right? So that's one piece. Interview your clients. And then the other benefit of interviewing your clients is that more than likely, they're going to know other people in their network who are similar to them, right? They may be in the same industry, and they're, with them being in their sphere of influence, if this person that you're interviewing is an ideal client, they're going to know more of them, or they're going to be able to bring you to more of them. So that's one piece. The other piece is all the philosophies that you have, all the frameworks that you have, all of those things. when you sit down for content, I don't want you to look all over the place. I want you to begin to think, how can you share your framework in an episode and then begin to pull out case studies of other people that you've helped? When you do this in episodes, people are going to listen. They're going to say, oh, wow, you helped Kelly, and Kelly was a speaker, or you helped this person who was a consultant. And then they're listening to all these stories. What you're then beginning to do is you're beginning to break down barriers, limiting belief, and why they can't do this or why they shouldn't. And as you're breaking down their barriers, now these people are going to be prime real estate to be your next clients. So you want to take those things into account when you're doing episodes and when you're putting out content. You're not just putting it out to get views, to get listens, because I mean, all that stuff sounds great and all that stuff is cute. And yes, there is sponsorship. But if we're going to be real, the majority of people would be better off selling somebody into a high ticket program or doing some consulting versus trying to go secure a Joe Rogan podcast sponsorship deal or something. Like that's, I don't want to say it's unrealistic, but you're going to be better off selling a high ticket program versus trying to go chase a high dollar sponsorship. It's less competition.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like what I'm hearing you say, really the key is to connect with your ideal audience versus right out of the gate, chasing these sponsorships, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Connect with your ideal audience because, okay, let me put it like this. Imagine that there was a new iPhone that just released. Well, I'm not going to use them because there's too many. Apple has too many iPhones. Okay. Imagine that we'll just say Jordans, just for the sake of the example. At each store, they have so many pairs of a Jordan. And let's say that they did not advertise the Jordan before the release date. And they just opened the store one day and said, we got Jordans for sale. The Jordans are going to move and people are going to buy them. However, they didn't create an uproar. If you put yourself in a position to where you're letting people know, I have a coaching program. We only accept a few applicants. It's only going to be the first 5. And usually we book up quick. If you're creating an uproar, you're creating a supply and demand situation. And the psychology around that tells somebody, I need to act now before I miss out. The Jordans, people are going to come and buy them. They're going to move on, whatever. But it's not creating an uproar. We don't see that when there's an uproar, Black Friday, we see it on the news. When there's an uproar, when there's a launch, people go crazy for launches. So we want to make sure that we get things in place to where we can create an uproar, i.e., if we have an email list secured before we roll out a podcast launch, now we have a group of people that we can launch the podcast to where now we have a captive audience ready for our content before we even get started versus just, hey, I'm starting a podcast. Crickets.
Okay. Got it. So you mentioned before about framework, and I know, for those of us in a kind of coaching space, we know what that means. It's like our systematic process to get folks from point A to point B. But we're not in that space. It's really the idea of your thought leadership, right? Kind of your brilliance packaged up, right? So I also wanted to ask you, and you kind of started to talk about it, but what are some ways to best promote our podcast? I think that is the biggest question that I hear from a lot of corporate folks is like, how do I really get the momentum going?
Okay. Yeah. This is great. Thank you for keeping me on track, Kelly. Thank you for keeping me on track. Okay. So the first thing is we have to begin to assess, is the podcast even a priority? Okay. Because when corporations roll out marketing budgets and marketing plans and campaigns, they're putting money behind the stuff that they're pushing out. And I would suggest corporate people to put money behind your podcast. There's podcast promotion platforms. I did a campaign recently with one called Podcast Addict, but I mean, it was like a $200 campaign. And after the campaign, I got like 14 subscribers because I'm just trying to figure out what's the best one for me. But if you're a corporation, one, think about who's already internal and see how we can get them to listen to the podcast. Send it out on a newsletter. right? And depending on what the purpose of the internal podcast, well, I don't want to say internal podcast because some companies have private podcasts to where they share announcements and stuff like that. But if you have a podcast and you're wanting to get it to the masses, you got to put some money behind it, right? And you could do the Facebook ads, you could do Google ads, like all that different stuff. But then even outside of that, if you're a CEO, think about other podcasts or other platforms where you can put your face. Where can you put your face and where can you share the mission behind the company to where people are like, I had no idea that so-and-so company was driven by X mission, because that's going to make people want to find out more about you and about your podcast. So put money behind it, leverage social media to the max. You really got to leverage social media. LinkedIn, right? So companies and corporations can put out blog posts. Maybe if there was 3 points that they talked about on this episode, they can give 1 point in the blog and say, here the rest of the episode where we talk about the other main pillars of the company. Link podcast, podcast link insert here.
Love it. You bring up a really good point in terms of, one way to leverage is to start your own podcast. The other one would be to say, we're going to have our CEO go on a little tour and you're going to go on other people's podcasts within our industry to kind of get our message out there that can be really effective as well. So that's really something powerful to think about. Okay. So my second to last question.
Okay.
What are the common mistakes that you see newer podcasters making?
Quitting too soon. Quitting too soon is easily the biggest mistake that people are making in the podcast land. And it's quitting too soon because podcasts are one of the best examples, I believe, of the compound effect. The longer you podcast, the more success you're going to see. Another mistake would be trying to buy all the equipment and not knowing how to use any of it. And this is coming from a guy who's probably spent around $1,000 for equipment and microphones and everything like that. Master the bare minimum of what you need. Even if you're a corporation, you can start off with like I don't want to call it a basic mic, but a traditional mic. They have the Audio Technica is one of the mics. That's a great one to start with. Just start with what you need, right? Not that extra stuff. And another one would be not promoting the podcast, not telling people about the podcast, because that itself is going to lead to you having low numbers. And then by you having low numbers, psychologically, you're going to say, this isn't working. And you're going to give yourself the justification to quit. So those would be some things. And then not being a guest or cross promoting with other podcasts who there could be benefits for both parties, right? Because I'm sure people would love to interview a CEO of X company or somebody from Y company, whatever it might be. And then they can, cross promote. But if you never do the interviews and that's not an opportunity, and this is the last one for corporate people. If you know that you're the CEO, but you have no interest in doing the podcast, you don't want nothing to do with it, you don't want to touch it, you don't want to record nothing, then get a young, not necessarily young, but a young thought leader, right? Somebody who has just ideas, they're charismatic, they're a personality. You're like, we don't know what to do with this person. Let them run the podcast. Let them host the podcast. And then that way, when people hear this person, they will associate that energy with your brand and your company. So it would reflect really highly upon you.
Listen, you have given the people everything they need to know on today. So clearly you are a wealth of knowledge on this subject. So my last question for you is just to let us know where we can find more information about you, follow up with you and your services for those that are listening.
Most definitely. So the best way, I would say just shoot me an email, support@jonathanjonespeaks.com. That would be the best way to get in contact with me. If somebody's like, I just want to see if a podcast is even worth my time, I would love just to learn the steps. I would say go to www.getpaidwithpodcasting.com/book. And you can get a free copy of the book that I have back. Oh, it's over here. The book I have over here is called Get Paid with Podcasting. And it's geared towards speakers, but it gives you everything you need to know just in terms of how to start the podcast, how to market the podcast, all that, like everything, how to make money from the, it's all in the book. So www.getpaidwithpodcasting.com/book. And I'm Jonathan Jones on all the platforms.
Love it.
Jonathan Jones Speaks. Jonathan Jones Speaks. I'm sorry. Jonathan Jones Speaks.
Jonathan Jones Speaks. Love it.
That's it. Yes, ma'am.
Well, thank you so much. This was awesome.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate the opportunity to talk podcasting and storytelling. You know, it's essential. It's really essential in this era of okay. Kelly, one last thing. Can I share this one last thing?
Ahead.
Okay, this is the last thing. So often, many companies and corporations, they always are sitting at this roadblock. And the roadblock is, but how do I get people through the door? How do I get people to know what we do? How do I get people just to pique their interest, like the person doing the samples at Sam's or Costco's, wherever? You have to give them something that makes their mouths salivate. So what is that? And that's when we take a 60-second clip, 30 to 60-second clip of the podcast episode that you created. And this is the short form clip that leads to the long form. They hear the passion about your mission for your company, how you want to help parents who have children who have been diagnosed with autism. And then they say, well, I want to learn more about their morals. Listen to the rest of the podcast. So we have to get them reeled in with the right bait to end up getting them on the boat. That's it. I'm done. I'm done, Kelly. I'm done.
Love it. So good. And you've given us extra. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate you.